This week's lecture material is based on information from Chapter 25 in your textbook. We'll be looking at the different aspects of cellular metabolism or cellular respiration, how cells make energy. And I just want to also emphasize that you want to look at the PDF posting in your Blackboard shell of this PowerPoint as well. There will be a little more information or text associated with that PowerPoint, just to fill in some of the slides that we'll be covering here. All cells in the body require energy for many of their processes, and we know that the body's currency of energy is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And if we were to sum all of the reactions and all the cells in the body that use energy and create energy, this will be what we call metabolism. So we have to have energy come into the body to be able to make energy and to use energy within cells, and the energy that comes into the body is in the form of foodstuffs, so the carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins that we consume have chemical energy that we can then utilize to make ATP. If we look at energy and in the body, if we try to understand how we get energy from the foods, for example, that we eat, we just need to look at some basic principles of chemistry. We know that if we have a large molecule, let's say AB, that the energy in that molecule will be stored in the bonds that are connecting the different atoms, the different components of that molecule. So if we want to break apart this molecule, we're going to break the bonds, and by breaking bonds, we're allowing the energy that's in that bond to come off this reaction, and now we can use this energy for some other processes within the cell, for example. So now we have these two smaller components, A and B, and if we want to make a larger molecule, we have to create bonds, and to create bonds, we have to add energy to this reaction to create the bonds. When cells require the use of energy, they use the energy that's stored in the adenosine triphosphate molecules. So ATP is the body's energy currency. All cellular reactions that require energy use ATP, for example, the sodium-potassium pumps that we learned about in the cell membranes. Triphosphate refers to the fact that the structure has 3 phosphates, and the bonds between the phosphates is where the energy is that we can use when we break those bonds. So if we break off one phosphate bond here, energy comes off that reaction. The cell can use this energy now for other processes, and now we're left with 2 phosphate groups, and this structure now becomes adenosine diphosphate, ADP. If we were to break both of these phosphate bonds, we'd only be left with a single phosphate group, and ATP then would become AMP, adenosine monophosphate. The 2 major types of metabolic reactions in the body are anabolic and catabolic. Anabolic reactions involve the building of larger molecules from smaller molecules, which means that we have to build bonds. So this requires the use of energy. Anabolic reactions are necessary for the processes of growth and repair in the body. Catabolic reactions, on the other hand, involves the breaking of a large molecule into smaller molecules. So catabolic reactions involve the breaking of bonds, and then when we break these bonds, energy comes off those bonds, and then the cell or the body can use that energy for other processes. So the combination of all of the anabolic and catabolic reactions that occur in the body is known as metabolism. The 3 major classes of nutrient molecules that we consume are carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and proteins. Carbohydrates are large molecules that are made up of a chain of simple sugar molecules known as monosaccharides, such as glucose. Lipids, or fats, also known as triglycerides, have the building blocks glycerol and fatty acids, and proteins are made up of chains of amino acids. This slide will illustrate the relationship between catabolic reactions, anabolic reactions, and the formation of ADP and ATP. So if we start with large complex molecules such as proteins or triglycerides that we eat, will use catabolic reactions in the process of digestion to break these large molecules and get the energy that's stored off those bonds, and add that energy to the ADP structure by binding a phosphate group, and now this becomes ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We now have these basic building blocks from the large molecules that we've broken down. We can now use the energy stored in that ATP molecule to do anabolic reactions in the cell to create larger structures that's required by the cell. And in that case, we're going to use ATP, so now we break a phosphate bond and we go back to ADP, and notice that there's heat released in both anabolic and catabolic reactions. The metabolic rate then of the body is defined as the amount of energy required to create or to perform all of the anabolic and catabolic reactions in the body. And we noted on the last slide that both anabolic and catabolic reactions result in the production of heat. So it's measured, metabolic rate can be measured as the amount of total heat produced by all of these reactions. So if somebody has an increased metabolic rate, they tend to create a lot of heat, they tend to be warm. And somebody who has a lowered metabolic rate are creating less heat, and they tend to feel cold all the time. The basal metabolic rate then, the BMR, reflects then the energy required by the body to perform the metabolic reactions for its most essential activities, organ functions, breathing, etc. Remember then that the chemical energy that is in the molecules that makes up the food that we consume is held in the bonds of those molecules. So the preferred fuel of most cells in the body is glucose, the sugar glucose. And so when we get energy from glucose, when cells get energy from glucose, they're going to get that energy from the bonds that make up the glucose molecule. So we're going to break these bonds. This is known as oxidation of glucose, or the burning of glucose. And these oxidation reactions that occur within the cell are known as cellular respiration. For cells to use glucose as a source of fuel, we first have to get the glucose molecule into the cell. And glucose is a very large molecule, and it can't travel across the cell membrane on its own. It requires a protein carrier, a glucose transporter. And the door to the glucose transporter is only going to open when this other reaction occurs first. So we have the hormone insulin here that has to bind to an insulin receptor on the cell membrane. And once this binding happens, then the door to the glucose transporter opens and glucose is allowed to enter into the cell. Now we could use the glucose by breaking the bonds of the glucose molecule. We can get the energy that's stored in those bonds. The process of cellular respiration then refers to the reactions that occur within a cell, primarily using glucose to form energy, to create energy. So we're going to oxidize glucose. This is the reason why we breathe oxygen. We're going to use oxygen in this process to fuel this process within the cell to break the bonds of glucose and to get the energy that's stored in those bonds, and primarily for the purpose of making ATP. This is a very efficient process. Approximately 40% of the energy that's in these bonds that are being broken in glucose are going to be captured and stored in the form of ATP. When we look at these different reactions that occur within the cell, the oxidation reactions, the burning of glucose, these are known as oxidation reduction reactions, or redox reactions. And as a basic concept, when something is oxidized, it's losing electrons. And the electrons, remember, are what creates the bond between atoms, between molecules. So if something is being oxidized, it's losing electrons, which means it's losing energy, that loss of that energy that's stored in that bond. Whenever something is oxidized, something else has to be reduced. And if something is being reduced, it means it's gaining electrons, which means it's gaining the energy. Okay, so in a bond, it's the electrons that are creating the bond between molecules, and it's the electrons then that are holding the energy. So when we have glucose come into the cell, we want to start breaking the bonds of glucose, and so we're going to be oxidizing glucose, which means As we're breaking these bonds, the glucose molecule is giving off electrons. Remember that the electrons is what's holding the energy in those glucose bonds. And remember that when something is being oxidized, something else will be reduced. So something has to accept those electrons, accept that energy from those broken glucose bonds. And we have two coenzymes within the cell that do this, NAD and FAD. So these two structures will accept the electrons, accept the energy from the glucose bonds that are being broken, and then these coenzymes will transfer that energy to another part of the cell and now this energy can be used to make ATP. Here we see the structure of a glucose molecule. Glucose is a large molecule, lots of bonds. It's a 6-carbon structure. And we'll see that as we look at the different chemical reactions that occur within the cell, the reactions of cellular respiration, as we oxidize glucose, we start to break the bonds of glucose between these carbon atoms. And the energy that is stored in these bonds will then be used to make ATP within the cell. So the chemical reactions that involve cellular respiration within the cell are broken down into three different phases. So the first phase will be glycolysis. You have to know that this occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. And the next two stages, citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, you need to know that these both occur in the mitochondria of the cell. You have to know that this is the reaction. You need to know this equation, that we start off with a glucose molecule and we add oxygen. This is the reason why we breathe oxygen. And the end product of this cellular respiration is going to be carbon dioxide, water, roughly 36 ATP from the oxidation of one glucose molecule, and we make a lot of heat. And so this heat is necessary for maintaining the internal temperature of the body. The first phase of cellular respiration then is glycolysis. You have to know that glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell and that it's an anaerobic process, which means it doesn't require oxygen. You have to know that we start with one glucose molecule and it results in the formation of two 3-carbon pyruvic acid molecules, and that we also make a net gain of 2 ATP in glycolysis. So we use 2 ATP here, but we've made 4 over here, so there's a net gain of 2. We also make 2 NADH and 2 hydrogen ion structures. So this complex here is what's carrying the energy that's in those broken bonds that we've broken in the glucose molecule. So remember, it's NAD, that is the coenzyme that is being reduced. It's accepting the electrons, it's accepting the energy from the broken bonds of the original glucose molecule. Now we'll look at what happens to pyruvic acid that's formed in the process of glycolysis. So if there's not enough oxygen available in the cell, for example, if you're at the end of a set in the gym, you're doing a bicep curl set and you're getting right to the end to fatiguing and you're feeling that burn in the muscle, you're feeling that because there's not enough oxygen available for the cells. So the pyruvic acid that's being formed is going to enter into the anaerobic pathway, which means no oxygen, not enough oxygen, and it's going to form lactic acid. And it's lactic acid that gives you that burning sensation in the muscle at fatigue. If there is enough oxygen available in the cell, the pyruvic acid will then enter the mitochondria, and through a series of reactions will end up converting to a structure called acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA then can enter into the Krebs cycle. Acetyl-CoA that enters the mitochondria, it will then be picked up by oxaloacetic acid and to form citric acid, which is a 6-carbon structure. Citric acid then will continue through a series of events or a series of reactions known as the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. And what occurs here is that there's a continued oxidation or breaking of bonds of these different intermediate molecules, and as well as the production of carbon dioxide, as we see. And with the breaking of these bonds, energy will come off these structures and will be picked up by the coenzymes NAD and FAD. We see that one molecule of ATP is produced, and that these coenzymes NADH and FADH will be carrying the energy that has been liberated by these broken bonds. Notice also that we've made 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. The end products then of the citric acid or Krebs cycle will be for each citric acid entering the cycle, you'll create 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, 1 molecule of ATP by substrate level phosphorylation, and 3 molecules of NADH plus H and 1 FADH2. And remember, that's these 2 structures that are holding the energy from those electrons that are coming off those bonds that are being broken in the intermediate molecules of the citric acid cycle. However, these are the numbers for each citric acid, but if you look at your glycolysis, you should see that 1 molecule of glucose will end up making 2 citric acids that can enter the cycle. So if I was to ask you how many CO2, ATP, NADH, FADH2 are made from 1 molecule of glucose, you would have to double these numbers. To review to this point, we've brought glucose into the cell. Glucose will undergo glycolysis to become pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid will then enter into the mitochondria, and with acetyl-CoA become citric acid, which then will enter into the Krebs cycle. And recall that in both Krebs cycle and glycolysis, we're oxidizing structures, so we're breaking bonds. And the energy that's coming off those bonds is being picked up by the coenzymes FAD and NADH. And it's those coenzymes that will then bring that energy to the electron transport chain, the final stage of cellular respiration. This also occurs in the mitochondria, and this process requires oxygen. This is aerobic respiration at this point, and this is where most of the ATP will be produced. The electron transport chain is a series of enzymes located in the inner mitochondrial membrane. These enzymes will accept the high energy electrons that are being carried by the NADH and the FADH that as a result of the bonds that were broken in the Krebs cycle and in glycolysis. And these enzymes will use some of that energy to pump hydrogen ions from the matrix of the mitochondria into the space between the inner and outer mitochondrial membranes. So this is going to start creating a hydrogen or a proton concentration gradient, and this is known as the proton motive force that we'll look at a bit more in the next slide. And notice also that at this stage that oxygen is going to function as the final acceptor of those high energy electrons, and with the result of creating water. So we've seen that these electron chain enzymes are proton pumps. They're pushing or pumping protons, hydrogen ions, to the space between the inner and outer mitochondrial membranes. This is creating a high concentration of hydrogen ions on this side of the membrane, plus an increasing positive charge relative to this side of the membrane. So if given the opportunity, these hydrogen ions will want to flow back down the concentration gradient and from positive to negative charge. And if given the opportunity to do that, which is what this structure does, ATP synthase, those hydrogen ions will flow back into the matrix. And as they're doing this, this is a state of energy that is going from an area of high potential energy to an area of low potential energy. So as this is occurring, energy is coming off these protons, these hydrogen ions, as they're flowing back through, and that energy is getting picked up by ADP to make ATP. So recall then that the electron transport chain is where aerobic respiration occurs. This is where we're using oxygen to do this process. And again, this occurs in the inner mitochondrial membrane within the mitochondria. And this is where most ATP in the cell is made. So roughly 32 ATP are made from one glucose molecule that enters the cell. And the ATP that's formed in the electron transport chain is by a process called oxidative phosphorylation. Remember that the final acceptor of the electrons in the electron transport chain is oxygen, and so the oxygen along with the protons will form water. This slide then will summarize cellular respiration, the 3 stages of cellular respiration. Know that glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, that it's an anaerobic process, it doesn't require oxygen. Know the end products of glycolysis. If oxygen is present in the cell, pyruvic acid will continue on through become acetyl-CoA and enter into citric acid or Krebs cycle. And then the energy from both Krebs and glycolysis carried in the NADH and FAD coenzymes is brought to the electron transport chain. That's in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this is, remember that the oxygen is the final acceptor of energy at this point to make water. And most of the ATP is made in this electron transport chain by aerobic respiration. Approximately 36 ATP are made from one original glucose molecule. So when we use glucose as a fuel in the body, we're going to start with glucose, we're going to use oxygen, and we're going to end up making water, which stays as it becomes part of the internal environment of the body. We're going to make carbon dioxide that needs to be breathed out. We're going to make 36 ATP from one glucose molecule, so this is our energy source now that we can use for other cellular processes, and we make a lot of heat that helps to maintain the internal environment, the internal temperature of the body. So we have two types of respiration. We have external respiration in the body. This is a representation of the lungs, so this is where we exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with the outside world. We bring oxygenated blood to the cells in the body, and this is where internal respiration occurs and the production of ATP in the mitochondria of the cell. If we look at what happens when you consume carbohydrates in your diet, if you consume carbohydrates, it'll with digestion, your blood glucose levels will rise. This will stimulate the pancreas to secrete insulin, the hormone insulin. Remember, insulin is required to bind to receptors on cell membranes, and that will open up the glucose transporter doors and allow glucose to enter into the cells. Once glucose is in the cells, we're going to use glucose to make ATP, and if there's still glucose available in the blood, it will then go into storage, and the storage form of glucose is called glycogen, and that's primarily in the liver that we find glycogen. And if there's still excess glucose in the blood, you will convert that energy to fats or fatty acids and glycerol and store it in your adipose tissue or your fat cells. It's important to know that cells, first of all, most cells in the body prefer carbohydrates, prefer glucose, to use glucose as a fuel for making ATP. But cells can also use fats, and they can use proteins as well that can enter into glycolysis, can enter into Krebs cycle, can be converted to acetyl-CoA, with the end result of making ATP if necessary. If there's not enough glucose available, whether in immediate form or as storage form as glycogen, then the body can use fats and proteins to make ATP. But we'll see when we look at some other pathologies, specifically diabetes, why this can cause problems in the body. The use of fats or lipids to make energy, if glucose is not available, we see the process here. The glycerol can enter into glycolysis through this pathway. And fatty acids, remember that the building blocks of lipids are glycerol and fatty acids. Fatty acids can, through what's called beta oxidation in the mitochondria, be converted into acetyl-CoA. So once we get to acetyl-CoA, that can now enter Krebs cycle and eventually through electron transport chain and make lots of ATP. In fact, fats are extremely energy concentrated structures. Remember that from one molecule of glucose we make approximately 36 ATP, but if we were to burn one molecule of fatty acids, the yield would be approximately 112 molecules of ATP, so it's a very rich source of energy. Three definitions to learn. Glycogenesis refers to the formation of glycogen, the body's storage form of glucose. Most of this occurs in the liver. So when cells have used or had enough glucose available to make the ATP required, then if there's glucose still available, it will be put into storage form in the form of glycogen. Glycogenolysis, lysis refers to breaking down, so breakdown of glycogen. If your blood glucose is low, you haven't eaten for a number of hours, you will start to break down glycogen stores in the liver to raise blood glucose levels back up. Gluconeogenesis, neo refers to new, genesis, creation. So you're forming new glucose molecules from non-carbohydrate molecules, so from fats and proteins. And once this happens, now the glucose can enter into glycolysis, Krebs cycle, for the purpose of making ATP in the